William of Ockham begins his philosophy with a habit that seems almost ordinary, but has extraordinary consequences. Whenever people try to explain something, they often make it far more complicated than it needs to be. They invent hidden forces, unnecessary assumptions, and elaborate systems that appear impressive but add little to genuine understanding. Ockham believes philosophy should move in the opposite direction. Before accepting a complicated explanation, ask whether a simpler one already accounts for what is being observed. If it does, there is no reason to multiply ideas beyond necessity. This way of thinking would later become famous as Occam's razor. Although it is often described as the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the best, his actual point is more careful than that. Simplicity alone does not make something true. A simple explanation can still be wrong. What matters is refusing to invent unnecessary explanations when the evidence does not require them. Good thinking is not about making reality simple. It is about refusing to complicate it without good reason. This attitude shapes his entire approach to philosophy. Rather than beginning with enormous systems meant to explain everything at once, he prefers to start with what can actually be known. Human beings often rush towards sweeping conclusions because certainty feels comforting. Occam slows that process down. He asks what evidence exists, what follows logically from that evidence, and where the limits of knowledge begin. For him, these limits matter greatly. People frequently speak with complete confidence about things they cannot directly know. They build theories that stretch far beyond experience, treating speculation as though it were established fact. Occam sees this as one of the greatest dangers facing philosophy. The desire to explain everything can tempt thinkers into confusing imagination with knowledge. This does not mean he rejects reason. On the contrary, he has enormous respect for clear thinking. What he rejects is the habit of allowing reason to wander beyond the support of evidence. A careful philosopher should know not only how to argue, but also when to stop arguing, because the available evidence has reached its limits. Admitting uncertainty is often a sign of intellectual honesty rather than weakness. His concern for clarity also changes the way he thinks about language. Words are useful because they allow people to communicate, compare ideas, and organize experience. Yet words can also create confusion. Human beings sometimes become so attached to names and categories that they begin treating them as if they were independent realities. Occam warns against this mistake. Simply giving something a name does not prove that it exists as a separate thing. This idea becomes especially important in his treatment of universal concepts. Philosophers before him had debated whether ideas such as humanity, beauty, justice, or goodness possess an existence of their own beyond individual examples. Occam takes a remarkably direct position. What actually exists are individual people, individual trees, individual animals, and individual events. General terms help the mind organize experience, but they should not automatically be mistaken for separate realities existing somewhere beyond the world. This emphasis on individuals gives his philosophy a grounded quality. Reality is encountered through particular things rather than abstract entities. Human beings meet actual people, not humanity itself. They experience particular acts of kindness, not kindness floating independently through the universe. General concepts remain useful, but they exist because the human mind recognizes similarities among individuals, not because they possess an independent existence apart from them. His approach also reflects a deep respect for observation. Before constructing elaborate explanations, one should pay careful attention to what is actually present. The world often reveals more through patient observation than through complicated speculation. This does not eliminate the need for reason. Instead, it anchors reason in experience rather than allowing it to drift into endless abstraction. Another important feature of his philosophy concerns humility. Human beings naturally enjoy certainty. They prefer complete answers to difficult questions. Yet Ockham repeatedly reminds his readers that reality is larger than any system created to explain it. Knowledge grows through careful investigation, but there will always remain questions that exceed human understanding. Recognizing those limits protects philosophy from becoming dogmatic. He also believes that disagreement often arises because people assume more than they can actually demonstrate. Once unnecessary assumptions are removed, many debates become much clearer. Some disagreements disappear entirely because they depended upon ideas that never needed to be introduced in the first place. Simplicity, therefore, becomes a tool for discovering truth rather than merely making explanations shorter. His philosophy extends beyond logic into everyday life. Human beings frequently complicate their own problems by adding fears, assumptions, and imagined possibilities that have little connection to reality. A simple misunderstanding becomes a lasting conflict because people create stories around it without verifying the facts. A small uncertainty becomes overwhelming because the mind invents countless explanations unsupported by evidence. Occam's habit of clearing away unnecessary assumptions becomes valuable not only in philosophy, but in ordinary thinking as well. This approach encourages intellectual discipline. Before accepting an explanation, ask whether every part of it is genuinely needed. Before believing a claim, ask what evidence supports it. Before creating a theory, ask whether it explains more than simpler alternatives. These questions do not eliminate mystery. They prevent mystery from being replaced with unnecessary complexity. As his philosophy unfolds, a distinctive vision of wisdom begins to appear. Wisdom is not measured by the ability to construct the largest or most impressive system. It is measured by the ability to think clearly, speak carefully, and distinguish between what is known, what is probable, and what remains uncertain. A disciplined mind values precision over excess and clarity over ornament. For William of Ockham, philosophy becomes an exercise in intellectual honesty. Strip away what is unnecessary. Keep only what reason and evidence genuinely require. Resist the temptation to explain more than can actually be explained. In doing so, the search for truth becomes quieter, more careful, and perhaps far closer to reality than the grand systems that attempt to answer every question at once. William of Ockham has little patience for arguments that become more impressive as they become less connected to reality. He notices that philosophers often begin with ordinary questions, but gradually disappear into layers of abstraction until they are debating ideas that cannot be tested, observed, or even clearly defined. To him, this is where philosophy starts losing its purpose. Thinking should bring people closer to reality, not farther away from it. A brilliant argument that explains nothing is less valuable than a modest one that helps people understand the world a little better. For that reason, he develops a habit of constantly asking what an explanation actually contributes. If removing one part of an argument changes nothing, then that part probably never deserved to be there. He's not trying to make philosophy smaller. He's trying to make it more honest. Every claim should earn its place. Every assumption should have a reason for existing. Ideas should not be preserved simply because they are old, respected, or difficult to challenge. This way of thinking demands a different kind of discipline from the philosopher. Instead of searching for the grandest possible explanation, Ockham searches for the most reliable one. He is willing to leave certain questions unanswered rather than pretend certainty where none exists. That restraint is one of the most distinctive features of his thought. Many people feel uncomfortable admitting they do not know something. Ockham considers that admission a sign of intellectual maturity. There is a difference between mystery and confusion. Mystery is what remains after careful thinking has reached its limit. Confusion is what happens when people stop thinking carefully altogether. His attention also turns toward the way human beings use language. Words are incredibly useful because they allow people to organize experience, communicate ideas, and preserve knowledge across generations. Yet words also create illusions. Once something has been given a name, people often begin acting as though the name itself proves the existence of a separate thing. Ockham believes this is one of the easiest mistakes the mind can make. Imagine someone speaking about justice. The word is meaningful, but justice itself is never encountered floating through the world on its own. What people actually experience are judges making decisions, neighbors treating one another fairly, parents correcting children, or strangers showing honesty. The general idea helps people describe these countless situations, but the reality always appears in particular actions performed by particular people. Forgetting this distinction allows language to quietly replace observation. The same caution applies to many of the broad categories people use every day. Terms like society, economy, tradition, or culture describe real patterns, yet none of them exist independently in the way individual people exist. Every society is made up of actual human beings making actual choices. Every tradition survives because individuals continue practicing it. Whenever abstract words become detached from the individuals who give them life, understanding begins to drift away from reality. Because of this, Ockham places enormous trust in observation. Before building explanations, look carefully. Before creating theories, pay attention to what is actually there. Human beings often rush toward conclusions because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. They connect dots too quickly, assume hidden causes without sufficient evidence, and construct elaborate stories from very little information. Ockham encourages patience instead. Reality deserves to be observed before it is explained. This patience extends into the search for knowledge itself. He does not believe the human mind is powerless. On the contrary, he believes people are capable of remarkable understanding. But genuine knowledge grows step by step. It begins with experience, continues through careful reasoning, and remains open to correction whenever new evidence appears. A mind that refuses correction gradually stops learning, no matter how intelligent it may seem. His philosophy quietly opposes intellectual pride in all its forms. Pride appears whenever someone becomes more interested in defending a theory than discovering whether it is true. It appears when admitting uncertainty feels more threatening than making unsupported claims. Ockham sees these habits as obstacles to wisdom because they place the ego above reality. The purpose of philosophy is not to protect one's opinions. It is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when that journey requires abandoning ideas once held with complete confidence. He also recognizes that simplicity requires effort. Complicated explanations can often be produced by continually adding new assumptions whenever difficulties appear. Simplicity, by contrast, demands precision. Every unnecessary idea must be identified and removed without damaging the explanation itself. This is why clear thinking is often harder than complicated thinking. It requires the discipline to distinguish what is essential from what merely sounds impressive. These habits eventually shape a broader attitude toward life. They encourage people to pause before believing dramatic claims, to separate evidence from speculation, and to resist the temptation to explain more than they actually know. Much of human confusion comes not from reality being impossible to understand, but from the tendency to build unnecessary layers between ourselves and the world. By clearing those layers away, Ockham believes the mind becomes quieter, sharper, and far more capable of recognizing things as they truly are. Clear thinking, for William of Ockham, is not a talent reserved for scholars sitting in universities. It is a habit that anyone can develop. Every day, people make judgments about others, about themselves, and about the world, yet many of those judgments are formed long before enough evidence exists. A first impression becomes a permanent opinion. A rumor becomes accepted as fact. A coincidence is treated as proof. The mind naturally wants quick answers because uncertainty is uncomfortable. But Ockham believes that this desire often leads people away from the truth rather than toward it. He would probably encourage a person to slow down before reaching a conclusion. Not because every conclusion is wrong, but because haste has a way of filling empty spaces with assumptions. Once those assumptions settle into the mind, they become surprisingly difficult to remove. People begin defending ideas they never properly examined, simply because those ideas have become familiar. In this way, error often survives not through evidence, but through habit. This is why he values careful reasoning more than intellectual confidence. Confidence can be genuine, but can also be misleading. A person may speak with absolute certainty while understanding very little. Another may hesitate because they recognize the complexity of a problem, even though their judgment is far closer to the truth. Ockham teaches that certainty should follow evidence, not replace it. His approach also changes the meaning of wisdom. Wisdom is not collecting the greatest number of facts or mastering the most complicated theories. It is learning how to think well. It is knowing which questions deserve careful investigation, which claims require stronger evidence, and which mysteries should remain mysteries until better understanding becomes possible. The wise person is not the one who always has an answer. It is the one who knows the difference between knowledge and speculation. This attitude protects philosophy from becoming an exercise in imagination disguised as certainty. Human beings possess extraordinary creativity, and that creativity is valuable, but becomes dangerous when every possibility is treated as reality. Ockham repeatedly brings the mind back to solid ground. Ask what can actually be shown. Ask what follows from the evidence. Ask whether another assumption is truly necessary or whether the explanation already stands without it. His respect for individual things also carries an important lesson about everyday life. People often become absorbed in broad ideas while overlooking the realities closest to them. It is easy to speak about humanity while ignoring a neighbor. It is easy to discuss justice while acting unfairly toward a friend. It is easy to admire truth in theory while avoiding it in practice. Ockham quietly reminds us that life is always lived in particulars. Every act of honesty, every broken promise, every kind gesture, and every selfish decision happens in a specific moment involving specific people. That is where philosophy must eventually return. This practical spirit gives his thought an unusual freshness. He is less interested in building a magnificent intellectual monument than in giving people reliable tools for thinking. Those tools are simple enough to remember, but demanding enough to practice. Be careful with assumptions. Be honest about what you know. Do not mistake a useful word for a separate reality. Let evidence guide belief instead of forcing evidence to fit belief. None of these habits promises perfect knowledge, but together they create a mind that is far less likely to deceive itself. There's also a quiet humility running beneath everything he writes. Human beings often imagine that every mystery must have an immediate explanation, yet reality does not always cooperate with that expectation. Some questions remain open because the evidence is incomplete. Others remain open because they reach beyond the limits of human understanding. Ockham does not see this as a defeat. He sees it as a reminder that wisdom includes knowing where the boundaries of one's knowledge lie. For that reason, philosophy should never become an endless search for more complicated answers. It should become a search for greater clarity. Every unnecessary idea removed brings the mind a little closer to seeing reality without distortion. Every careless assumption abandoned creates space for a more honest understanding of the world. That process never truly ends, because every generation inherits old beliefs, new discoveries, and fresh questions that must all be examined again with the same discipline and the same willingness to follow the truth wherever it leads. William of Ockham leaves behind a philosophy that is remarkably quiet. It does not promise a grand system capable of answering every question, nor does it ask people to admire complexity for its own sake. Instead, it asks something far more demanding. Think carefully. Speak precisely. Do not claim more than you can honestly support. Those habits may seem modest, but he believes they are the foundation of genuine wisdom. His famous principle of avoiding unnecessary assumptions is often treated as a shortcut for solving problems. Yet its deeper purpose is intellectual discipline. The real lesson is not that reality must always be simple. Reality can be astonishingly complex. The lesson is that the human mind should not make it more complicated without good reason. Every explanation carries a responsibility to justify itself. This way of thinking changes more than philosophy. It changes the way a person approaches everyday life. Before accepting a frightening rumor, ask what evidence exists. Before judging another person, ask whether the facts are complete. Before becoming attached to a theory, ask whether it explains what is actually observed or only what is imagined. Many unnecessary conflicts survive because people defend assumptions they never stop to examine. Ockham also reminds us that words are useful servants but poor masters. Language helps people describe the world, yet can also hide the world behind layers of abstraction. A name should never become more important than the reality it points toward. The habit of returning from words to actual experience keeps philosophy connected to life instead of allowing it to drift into endless arguments about ideas detached from the world they are supposed to explain. There is a quiet honesty in this approach. Human beings are capable of remarkable understanding, but they're also capable of deceiving themselves. Pride, habit, and the desire for certainty often persuade people that they know more than they really do. Ockham answers this tendency with humility. He would rather admit the limits of knowledge than fill those limits with confident speculation. For him, acknowledging uncertainty is not weakness. It is respect for the truth. Perhaps this is why his philosophy has remained influential for centuries. Scientists, philosophers, historians, and investigators continue to value the habit of removing unnecessary assumptions before reaching conclusions. Although the subjects have changed, the discipline remains the same. Begin with what can be known. Follow the evidence carefully. Add nothing that reality itself does not require. His legacy is therefore larger than a single philosophical principle. It is a way of thinking that resists confusion without pretending to possess complete certainty. It encourages curiosity without carelessness, confidence without arrogance, and skepticism without cynicism. Instead of chasing explanations that impress others, it asks people to pursue explanations that are honest. In the end, William of Ockham invites us to trust that truth does not need unnecessary decoration. The clearer the mind becomes, the easier it is to recognize reality without forcing it into elaborate systems. A disciplined thinker is not the one who says the most, but the one who knows when enough has been said. By removing what is unnecessary, the essential gradually comes into view, and in that quiet clarity, philosophy fulfills its highest purpose, not by making the world seem more mysterious than it is, but by helping us see it as it truly is. There are philosophers whose names become famous because they offered comforting answers. Others are remembered because they changed the direction of history itself. William of Ockham belongs to the second group. He did not build grand visions of the universe like Plotinus. He did not tell dramatic stories about meaning like Viktor Frankl. Instead, he did something that often proves even more revolutionary. He taught people to think with discipline, to question assumptions, to strip away unnecessary complexity until only the strongest explanation remained. It sounds simple, almost obvious, yet this habit would quietly reshape philosophy, science, politics, and the modern way of understanding reality. Today, almost everyone has heard the phrase Occam's razor, even if they have never heard the name William of Ockham. It appears in science, medicine, engineering, criminal investigations, economics, and everyday decision-making. People invoke it whenever they say the simplest explanation is usually the best. But reducing Occam to that famous principle is like reducing Leonardo da Vinci to someone who liked painting. The The razor was only one small expression of a much larger revolution taking place inside his mind. To understand why his ideas were so disruptive, we must travel to England at the end of the 13th century. Europe was changing rapidly. Universities had become vibrant centers of learning where scholars debated theology, philosophy, law, and natural science with extraordinary intensity. Great thinkers, such as Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, had constructed immense philosophical systems attempting to explain reality from its highest principles down to the smallest details of human existence. These systems were brilliant, elegant, and astonishingly ambitious. Yet, as they grew larger, they also became increasingly complicated. New distinctions were added to solve old problems. Fresh theories appeared to explain earlier theories. Philosophical language became so technical that only a handful of specialists could navigate it. William of Ockham entered this intellectual world around the year 1287, born in the small English village from which he took his name. Like many promising young scholars of his time, he joined the Franciscan order, a religious community committed to humility, poverty, and disciplined study. The Franciscans valued learning deeply, but they also believed intellectual life should never become detached from reality. Knowledge was meant to illuminate truth, not simply impress audiences through complexity. This environment shaped Ockham profoundly. Even as a young student, he displayed an unusual impatience with arguments that seemed elegant but unnecessary. Whenever philosophers multiplied invisible entities, invented increasingly elaborate explanations, or created distinctions that solved one problem only by introducing three more, Ockham instinctively asked a disarmingly simple question. Do we actually need all of this? That question would become the defining habit of his entire career. His education eventually brought him to Oxford, one of Europe's great centers of learning. Oxford during the early 14th century was not merely a place where students memorized established ideas. It was a battlefield of competing philosophies. Classrooms echoed with debates over free will, the nature of God, universals, language, morality, and the limits of human knowledge. A scholar's reputation could be made or destroyed by the strength of an argument delivered before fellow academics. Ockham thrived in this atmosphere, but not because he sought public glory. He possessed a rare intellectual courage. He was willing to dismantle ideas that generations of respected thinkers had spent decades constructing if he believed those ideas rested on weak foundations. One of the greatest debates of the medieval world concerns something that seems surprisingly ordinary at first glance. When we use words such as tree, justice, beauty, or humanity, what exactly do those words refer to? Do universal concepts exist independently somewhere beyond individual objects, as Plato had suggested centuries earlier? Or are they simply useful ways of describing similarities between individual things? The debate had occupied philosophers for generations because its implications reached far beyond language. It shaped how people understood reality itself. Ockham approached the problem differently. Imagine walking through a forest. You see hundreds of trees. Each one has a different shape, different branches, different scars, different patterns of growth. They all belong to the category tree, yet no two are identical. Earlier philosophers often treated the universal idea of treeness almost as though it possessed its own independent existence. Ockham found this deeply suspicious. We certainly use universal words because they help us think and communicate, but that does not necessarily mean universals exist as separate realities outside the mind. For Ockham, what truly exists are individual things. This particular oak, that particular pine, this specific human being, that specific bird. The categories we create are useful mental tools, but they should not be mistaken for independent objects floating somewhere beyond reality. It was a subtle shift, yet it quietly transformed philosophy. Instead of beginning with abstract concepts, Ockham insisted that thinking should begin with the concrete world people actually encounter. This commitment to intellectual economy eventually became the principle later generations named Occam's razor. The phrase itself was coined long after his death, but it captures the habit that defined his thinking. Do not multiply explanations beyond necessity. If two theories explain the same evidence equally well, the one requiring fewer assumptions deserves preference. This was not a claim that reality is always simple. Occam knew reality could be astonishingly complex. His point was different. Complexity should emerge only when the evidence genuinely demands it, not because philosophers enjoy constructing elaborate systems. It is difficult to overstate how radical this mindset became. Human beings possess a remarkable talent for inventing explanations. We often add hidden causes, invisible forces, complicated stories, and unnecessary assumptions because they make us feel as though we understand the world more completely. Occam challenged this instinct relentlessly. Every unnecessary assumption weakens an explanation rather than strengthening it. Every idea must justify its own existence. What makes this philosophy feel surprisingly modern is that it extends far beyond medieval debates. Imagine hearing a strange noise outside your house at night. One explanation is that a branch struck the window during the wind. Another is that an elaborate conspiracy involving hidden intruders has begun unfolding outside. Both are technically possible. Occam would simply ask which explanation requires fewer unsupported assumptions. The goal is not to eliminate imagination, but to discipline it. Yet beneath this famous principle lay something even deeper. Occam was slowly redefining the purpose of philosophy itself. Philosophy should not exist to construct magnificent intellectual palaces admired only by scholars. It should help human beings distinguish between what they truly know, what they reasonably infer, and what they merely speculate. This insistence on intellectual honesty would eventually influence not only philosophers, but scientists centuries later. Before asking what could be true, Occam wanted people to ask what they were genuinely justified in believing. It was a deceptively modest ambition. In reality, it would help change the course of Western thought forever. As William of Ockham's reputation spread through the universities of England and France, it became increasingly clear that he was not simply refining the ideas of earlier philosophers. He was quietly dismantling the assumptions that had dominated medieval thought for centuries. This made him both admired and deeply controversial. Scholars respected the sharpness of his arguments, but many also sensed that if Occam were correct, an enormous portion of the intellectual architecture built by previous generations would have to be reconsidered. The heart of his philosophy was never destruction for its own sake. Occam was not interested in proving everyone else wrong simply to appear clever. His concern was honesty. He believed the human mind has a dangerous habit of pretending to know more than it actually does. Once people become attached to elegant theories, they often begin confusing imagination with knowledge. They mistake beautiful explanations for true explanations. Occam believed this temptation existed everywhere, not only in philosophy, but in politics, religion, science, and everyday life. Think about how easily people construct stories. Someone fails to reply to a message, and within minutes another person has imagined rejection, betrayal, anger, or hidden motives. A rumor spreads through a community, and before long, an entire narrative has formed around almost no evidence at all. Nations convince themselves that enemies possess secret plans. Markets panic because investors begin believing stories that later prove false. The human mind dislikes uncertainty so intensely that it often fills empty spaces with assumptions. Occam recognized this long before psychology existed. He understood that ignorance feels uncomfortable. People would rather believe a complicated story than admit they simply do not know. Yet he insisted that genuine wisdom begins precisely with that admission. There is extraordinary intellectual strength in saying, "I do not yet have enough evidence." This attitude made him unusually humble in one sense and remarkably fearless in another. He was willing to question respected authorities because authority alone did not create truth. At the same time, he refused to replace old certainties with new ones unless those new ideas were genuinely supported. He distrusted unnecessary confidence regardless of where it came from. One of the areas where this became especially clear was his understanding of human knowledge itself. Earlier philosophers often believed that reason could climb steadily upward until it explained almost every aspect of reality. Ockham admired reason immensely, but he believed reason had limits. Some truths could be demonstrated logically. Others could only be accepted through faith. Confusing these two domains weakened both philosophy and religion. This distinction was revolutionary. For centuries, many thinkers had tried to build a complete system where every theological belief could be defended entirely through philosophical reasoning. Ockham believed this ambition misunderstood both reason and faith. If something belongs to faith, it should not pretend to be a philosophical proof. If something belongs to philosophy, it should not demand belief without evidence. In other words, he wanted intellectual honesty in both directions. This position unexpectedly created more space for scientific thinking in later centuries. By separating what could be investigated through observation from what belonged to religious belief, Ockham helped establish an attitude that would eventually become central to modern science. Scientists do not begin with certainty. They begin with observation. They gather evidence. They test explanations. They eliminate unnecessary assumptions. Although Ockham lived centuries before the scientific revolution, many historians see his influence quietly preparing the ground for it. Yet his life would soon move beyond academic debates. As his ideas spread, Ockham found himself drawn into one of the greatest political and religious conflicts of the Middle Ages. The Franciscan order, to which he belonged, had long argued that true Christian life required radical poverty. They believed Christ and the apostles had owned little or no property and that the church should follow their example. This was not merely a theological disagreement. It was a question about power. The medieval church had become one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe. It owned vast lands, collected revenues, influenced kings, and shaped nearly every aspect of public life. To suggest that the church should embrace poverty was, in effect, to question how religious authority itself ought to be exercised. Ockham sided with the Franciscans, not because he hated the church, but because he believed institutions, like individuals, must remain accountable to truth rather than convenience. His commitment to intellectual integrity naturally extended into political life. If authority became detached from justice, then authority deserved criticism. This conviction brought him into direct conflict with Pope John XXII. The dispute escalated rapidly. Accusations of heresy began to circulate. Ockham was summoned to answer for his ideas. What had started as philosophical disagreements now threatened his freedom and perhaps even his life. Imagine the pressure. One of Europe's greatest thinkers suddenly found himself facing the most powerful religious institution on the continent. Many people would have withdrawn their arguments to protect themselves. Others would have surrendered quietly. Ockham chose neither path. After years of growing tension, he fled from Avignon, where the papal court was located, seeking protection from Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria. According to tradition, Ockham is said to have told the emperor something that perfectly captures his character. "Defend me with the sword, and I will defend you with the pen." Whether those were his exact words or not, they reflect the reality of his life. He understood that ideas possess enormous political power. A philosopher is not merely someone who writes books. A philosopher can reshape how societies think about authority, justice, evidence, and freedom. And Ockham was beginning to realize that the questions he had spent years asking inside university lecture halls reached far beyond philosophy itself. They touched the foundations of power, the limits of authority, and the right of every human being to question claims that lacked sufficient justification. Those questions would define the final years of his life, and they would ensure that William of Ockham's legacy extended far beyond the famous razor that now bears his name. As William of Ockham settled into exile under the protection of Emperor Louis IV, his philosophy entered its most mature and perhaps most courageous stage. Until this point, he had been known primarily as a scholar who challenged complicated theories and demanded intellectual discipline. Now he was becoming something more. He was becoming a philosopher of power itself. The same habit of mind that had led him to question unnecessary assumptions in philosophy was now leading him to ask uncomfortable questions about governments, institutions, and authority. His reasoning was remarkably consistent. If no idea should be accepted simply because a respected scholar proposed it, then neither should political or religious authority escape examination merely because it possessed power. This was a dangerous position to hold in the 14th century. Medieval Europe was built upon hierarchies. Kings ruled by divine sanction. The church exercised enormous influence over both public and private life. Most people accepted that authority naturally flowed from the top downward. Ockham did not reject authority altogether. He understood that every society requires order, leadership, and institutions. But he insisted on something that sounded almost revolutionary for his time. Authority exists to serve truth and justice, not the other way around. That simple reversal carried profound consequences. Throughout history, people have often confused power with correctness. When someone speaks confidently, wears impressive clothing, holds a prestigious office, or commands a large following, others instinctively assume they must also possess wisdom. Ockham distrusted this instinct. He had spent too many years watching brilliant scholars defend weak arguments, simply because those arguments had become traditional. He had watched respected authorities resist criticism not because criticism was false, but because admitting error threatened their position. Human beings, he realized, are deeply tempted by certainty, not necessarily because certainty is true, because certainty feels safe. A society built entirely upon unquestioned certainty eventually stops thinking. People begin repeating conclusions without remembering why those conclusions were reached in the first place. Curiosity disappears. Inquiry becomes dangerous. Over time, institutions become more concerned with protecting themselves than with pursuing truth. Ockham believed this represented one of the greatest dangers facing civilization. He was not encouraging permanent rebellion or endless skepticism. His point was subtler than that. Every claim, regardless of who makes it, should remain open to careful examination. If an idea is true, investigation will strengthen it rather than destroy it. If an institution genuinely serves justice, honest criticism should improve it rather than threaten its existence. Centuries later, this attitude would become one of the cornerstones of modern democratic societies, scientific research, and free intellectual inquiry. Yet during Ockham's own lifetime, these ideas placed him in continual conflict with some of the most powerful people in Europe. His writings from this period increasingly explored political philosophy alongside theology. He argued that rulers were not absolute owners of their subjects. Political authority carried responsibilities as well as privileges. Governments existed for the common good, not merely for the preservation of power. Likewise, religious authority possessed limits. No institution, however sacred, became incapable of error simply because it claimed divine legitimacy. These arguments did not emerge from personal bitterness. They emerged from a lifetime spent asking the same disciplined question. What evidence justifies this claim? It is remarkable how often this question exposes human weakness. Consider modern life. Every day, people encounter headlines, political speeches, social media posts, advertisements, conspiracy theories, and confident opinions presented as undeniable truth. Most individuals rarely pause to ask Occam's question. What evidence actually supports this? How many assumptions am I accepting without noticing them? Is this explanation genuinely necessary? Or has someone added complexity to make a story sound more convincing? In many ways, Occam seems astonishingly contemporary because he understood that misinformation is not merely a technological problem. It is a human problem. Long before the internet, people believed rumors, exaggerated stories, and elegant theories unsupported by reality. Technology changes. Human psychology changes very little. Perhaps this is why his famous razor has survived for nearly 700 years. It is not simply a rule for scientists. It is a habit of mind, a reminder to resist the seductive pull of unnecessary complexity, a reminder that intelligence is not measured by how elaborate an explanation becomes, but by how faithfully it reflects reality. Yet there was another side to Occam that is sometimes overlooked. For all his criticism of intellectual excess, he remained deeply aware of the limits of human understanding. Some people imagine his philosophy encourages complete certainty through simplicity. In fact, the opposite is often true. Removing weak explanations frequently leaves us facing mystery rather than certainty. And Occam was comfortable with that. He believed there was dignity in admitting that some questions remained unanswered. Human beings often fear uncertainty because uncertainty feels like failure. Occam regarded it differently. Pretending to know what we do not know is a far greater failure than honestly acknowledging ignorance. Intellectual humility, in his view, was not weakness. It was one of the highest forms of wisdom. This humility explains why his influence reached so far beyond medieval philosophy. Scientists, historians, physicians, detectives, engineers, economists, and ordinary people continue using habits of thought remarkably similar to those he encouraged. Observe carefully. Remove unnecessary assumptions. Distinguish evidence from speculation. Accept uncertainty where certainty cannot honestly be achieved. These principles seem almost obvious today precisely because thinkers like Occam helped make them part of the intellectual foundation of the modern world. As the years passed, the aging Franciscan scholar remained far from the great universities where his career had begun. Yet exile did not silence him. If anything, distance allowed him to think even more deeply about the relationship between truth, freedom, and authority. The final chapter of his life would not be marked by dramatic victories or public triumphs. Instead, it would reveal something quieter, but perhaps even more enduring. The lasting power of an honest mind that refused to value certainty above truth. The final years of William of Ockham's life were spent far from the quiet classrooms where his intellectual journey had begun. He remained under the protection of Emperor Louis IV, separated from the center of ecclesiastical power and still regarded with suspicion by those who believe his ideas threatened the established order. Yet exile did not diminish him. If anything, it clarified his purpose. Many thinkers spend their lives defending systems they inherited. Occam spent his life asking whether those systems deserved to survive at all. He had learned that truth is not protected by prestige, and wisdom does not automatically accompany authority. These lessons had come at a personal cost, but they had also convinced him that the greatest danger facing any civilization is not disagreement. It is the moment people stop asking whether what they believe is actually true. As he grew older, Occam increasingly reflected on the relationship between knowledge and humility. It is easy to assume that a philosopher famous for cutting away unnecessary ideas must have believed that everything could eventually be explained. In reality, he believed almost the opposite. The more honestly human beings investigate the world, the more they discover the boundaries of their own understanding. Every answer reveals new questions. Every discovery uncovers deeper mysteries. For Occam, this was not discouraging. It was liberating. Human beings become wiser not by pretending to possess certainty about everything, but by learning where certainty genuinely ends. This attitude remains surprisingly rare. Modern civilization often celebrates confidence more than accuracy. Public figures speak as though every problem has an obvious solution. Social media rewards certainty while punishing hesitation. People become suspicious of anyone who admits they are still thinking or that they do not yet know enough. The result is a culture filled with loud opinions, but often lacking careful judgment. Ockham would have found this deeply troubling. He understood that intelligence is not measured by the speed with which someone reaches conclusions. It is measured by the discipline with which they examine them. An impatient mind mistakes possibility for proof. A careful mind separates observation from assumption, evidence from speculation, confidence from truth. This distinction may seem small, yet entire civilizations rise or fall, depending upon whether they preserve it. History repeatedly shows what happens when societies become attached to beautiful stories instead of uncomfortable realities. Leaders surround themselves with flattering explanations. Institutions defend traditions long after those traditions stop serving the common good. Entire populations convince themselves that what they wish to be true must therefore be true. Ockham recognized these dangers because he had watched them unfold during his own lifetime. He knew that human beings possess an extraordinary ability to deceive themselves while remaining completely sincere. Perhaps that is why his philosophy still feels so fresh 7 centuries later. He reminds us that the greatest enemy of truth is often not ignorance. It is unnecessary certainty. His influence after death spread in ways he could never have imagined. The Renaissance would rediscover the value of direct observation. The scientific revolution would insist that theories must answer to evidence rather than authority. Thinkers such as Francis Bacon, Galileo, and later Isaac Newton worked within an intellectual climate that increasingly valued simplicity, precision, and disciplined inquiry. Ockham did not create modern science by himself, but he helped cultivate the intellectual habits that made it possible. His political ideas also continued echoing through history. By insisting that authority required justification rather than blind obedience, he quietly contributed to traditions that would later influence constitutional government, individual rights, and the belief that power itself should remain accountable. These developments did not appear overnight, nor did they arise from Ockham alone. History is never that simple, yet his questions became part of a much larger conversation that gradually reshaped the Western world. Ironically, the man remembered for a razor did not spend his life trying to make reality smaller. He spent his life trying to make human thinking more honest. There is an important difference. Reality itself may be unimaginably complex. The universe contains mysteries that continue to challenge scientists, philosophers, and theologians alike. Ockham never denied that. What he opposed was the human tendency to complicate explanations without necessity, to invent hidden mechanisms where evidence was absent, and to mistake intellectual decoration for genuine understanding. His philosophy, therefore, carries an unexpected moral lesson. The search for truth requires courage, not because truth is always difficult to understand, but because it often demands that we surrender explanations we have grown comfortable believing. It asks us to say those difficult words. I was mistaken. I do not know. There is not enough evidence. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of intellectual integrity. Perhaps that is William of Ockham's greatest legacy. He transformed simplicity from a matter of style into a matter of character. Simplicity, in his hands, was never laziness. It was discipline. It required resisting the temptation to explain more than reality itself permitted. It required respecting evidence, even when evidence challenged cherished beliefs. And above all, it required the humility to recognize that the world does not become clearer simply because human beings tell themselves increasingly elaborate stories about it. When William of Ockham died around 1347, Europe was standing on the edge of one of the darkest periods in its history. The Black Death would soon sweep across the continent, reshaping societies, economies, religions, and political systems. The world he knew was changing rapidly. Yet while kingdoms fractured and institutions struggled to survive, one quiet habit of thought endured. Ask what you truly know. Question what you merely assume. Do not multiply explanations beyond necessity. It is astonishing that such a simple discipline continues guiding doctors diagnosing illnesses, scientists testing theories, detectives solving crimes, engineers designing machines, historians evaluating evidence, and ordinary people trying to make sense of an increasingly complicated world. Perhaps that is the ultimate irony of William of Ockham's life. He never set out to become famous. He never tried to build the largest philosophical system. He never sought to explain every mystery of existence. Instead, he taught humanity something far more valuable. That wisdom often begins not by adding another idea, but by having the courage to remove one.